Thank you, Peter, and thank you all for being here. It's a beautiful Tuesday night in Aspen, and you're all here either because you're especially erudite or because there's nothing going on in town. As Peter said, I direct the Aspen seminar on leadership values and the good society. It's the week-long program that really is the legacy to the original Mortimer Adler seminar of great books for corporate executives that launched the Institute back in the early 50s, and was a kind of inheritance of what happened in both 1949 and 1950. And I'll say a little bit more about that, particularly the method of dialogue that emerged in the early 1950s that has really shaped the Institute. But before I do that, I think it's really marvelous to ask the question, why Plato? And I say that because Plato is absolutely central to what Adler and Hutchins at the founding of the Institute called, with Pepke, the Great Conversation. And I think it's especially important for those who are friends of the Institute to convene or reconvene from time to time to reflect on that founding vision. So what I'll do in asking the question, why Plato, is to talk a little bit about Plato himself, but to use that as a way of thinking about what the Institute became in mid-century, mid-20th century, and then also to talk a little bit about the shape of things today. I'm going to try to do that in about 25 or 30 minutes because it seems perverse to talk about Plato without actually having a dialogue for which Plato is famous. And we can have a dialogue in a room, an intimate room like this, where we're just a small group of friends sitting beside the fire for a chat. As I was thinking about what I might say tonight, I was reflecting on the beauty of the mountains. I'm a Colorado native. And also the intellectual legacy. I'm a graduate of the University of Chicago. And if you cross the University of Chicago with Colorado, you get the Aspen Institute. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that means. But I was down in the basement of the reception building, the Meadows reception building. And if you've seen some of the pictures by Ferenc Benko downstairs, you will look into the eyes of Mortimer Adler, you'll look into the eyes of Albert Schweitzer, you'll look into the eyes of Ortega y Gasset and Arthur Rubinstein. And last night in particular, I found that incredibly humbling because we, and I mean we in this room, are the heirs of quite an astonishing, audacious vision that these men and women, Elizabeth Pepke, had in mid-century. They were serious, and they felt a sense of urgency. And one of the things I often ask myself in this role as director of seminars is, am I sufficiently serious? And do I feel that sense of urgency? And that actually becomes part of Plato's story and I think I just lost my mic. Last year, I can project. Last year, as Peter said, Stephen Wicks gave a presentation called Why Goethe? Why 1949? Why Aspen? And I can't even begin to match his elegance or erudition in recapitulating what happened in 1949 with the marvelous historical and musical resources that he brought to bear. And if you haven't seen that talk, it is available on the Aspen Institute website. And I encourage you to look at it. And if you were here last year for that presentation, I encourage you to look at it again, because it is a recollection of the deep well springs of the Aspen Institute. That's better. And Stephen concluded that discussion by saying, we together need to keep the Aspen idea alive. And we often talk about the Aspen Institute in conjunction with the Aspen leaf, obviously, but also the Aspen grove. And the biologists know that an aspen grove, the aspen grove, has a series of individual trees, of course, but they're all connected by a common taproot. And so the biologists tell us that perhaps the largest living organism on the planet is an enormous aspen grove, I guess in Utah or Nevada somewhere. But that's an important image for me for a couple of reasons. First of all, we're all individuals, but you in the Society of Fellows, you who are friends of the Aspen Institute, constitute, through your participation, through your giving, and through your engagement in the Aspen idea, you constitute that taproot and the kind of sap that runs through. But it also stands as an image for the Aspen Institute as a whole, because we have a bazillion different programs, if you've ever tried to look at the website, and it's hard to know how they're all connected. But the third reason that I use this image is because the idea, the sap, the intellectual and moral engagement that runs through all of the programs that we do, we might call the great conversation. And I want to look tonight at someone who's absolutely central to that conversation, namely Plato. So Stephen Wicks asked last year 3 questions. Why Goethe? Why 1949? Why Aspen? I'm going to ask 3 questions tonight. Why Plato? Why dialogue? And why us? So if I were just to throw out there, and this is the participatory part of the talk, if I were to say Plato, what comes to mind? And shout it out so everybody can hear you. The cave. The shadows. Sorry? Greece. Spelled with a C. The unexamined life is not worth living. Dialectic. Sorry? Dionysus II. Now we're getting esoteric. Sorry? Questions. What else? 2 or 3 more. Passion. Ontology. Now we're getting really heady. And the philosopher king, Socrates. Wonderful. Plato, as Alfred North Whitehead said, every philosopher after Plato is a footnote in Western philosophy. Plato is a kind of taproot for so much of what we've come to think. And it ranges, as people have said, everything from the famous allegory of the cave, which some of us had an opportunity to discuss earlier this afternoon, to a discussion of ontology, what is real being, to the format of questioning that we now call Socratic, even though that means 100 different things, to the example of Dionysius II, the tyrant of Sicily. So let me tell you 2 stories. One is the story of Plato in Athens, and the other is the story of Plato in Sicily. Plato was a young man, and in a letter, the famous 7th letter, which may or may not be by Plato, but reasonably is close enough to reflect, it's not inconsistent with what we might expect from Plato. He says this, he says his friend Dion, who was in Sicily, said that his people ought to be free and live under the best of laws. But Plato continues, how do we learn the way in which these convictions come about is instructive to young and old alike. How do we come to know what the best laws are? When I was younger, he says, I had the same ambition as many others. I thought of entering public life as soon as I came of age, and certain happenings in public life favored me. There was, shall we say, a change of administration in ancient Greece, a coup. And it turns out that a lot of Plato's friends and relatives were involved in that coup, and they said, maybe you might join us in government. And Plato says that he was tempted by this. And he writes, I thought that they were going to lead the city out of the unjust life she had been living and establish her in the path of justice, so that I watched them eagerly to see what they would do. Alas, he was sorely disappointed. Instead of proceeding on the path of justice, they proceeded on the path of injustice. And he drew back And not long after that, this coup was overthrown, the democracy was reestablished, and he thought twice about getting involved in politics. And he reflected all the more. He said, the more I reflected upon what was happening, upon what kind of men were active in politics, and upon the state of our laws and customs, and the older I grew, the more I realized how difficult it is to manage a city's affairs rightly. And he goes on to say, to find men to lead would be difficult, and to train new leaders from scratch would be even more difficult. He continues, and the corruption of our written laws and our customs was proceeding at such amazing speed that whereas at first I had been full of zeal for public life, when I noted these changes and saw how unstable everything was, I became in the end quite dizzy. And though I did not cease to reflect on how an improvement could be brought about in our laws and in the whole Constitution, yet I refrained from action, waiting for the proper time. At last I came to the conclusion that all existing states are badly governed. And we'll pick up the rest of that quotation in a second. But why do I tell you this story? This is the first of two stories. This is Plato in Athens. He actually wants to be involved in the life of the community. And yet, what he sees there discourages him. He sees the flame of injustice, of selfishness, of ambition. He reaches out at his hand, it burns him, and he draws back. And so when we think of Plato the great philosopher, we think of Plato as the Monty Python philosopher football video shows of lots of gray-bearded, white-togaed men scratching their beards and looking up at the stars. That is one image of Plato, but it was actually an engagement with the world around that directed him toward that withdrawal. But Plato never lost sight of his interest in, his concern for, his love of the world of practical affairs. Which brings us to the second story, Dionysius II. Dionysius II was the young tyrant of Sicily. And they had a mutual friend called Dion, whom I mentioned earlier. And Plato got a letter from Dion saying, look, Dionysius II is a pretty good guy. He's young, he's impressionable, and he has a love of philosophy. We have an opportunity to put thought into action. Will you please come to Sicily? And Plato thinks about it and finally says yes. And he says yes for a couple of reasons. One, he says, the opportunity to have influence on a substantial leader, to bend him from the impulses of tyranny to the impulses of freedom and what Plato calls the best laws, is something that I can't in good conscience pass up. And then Plato says something else. He says, I didn't want to go to my grave, in effect, and consider myself as having been only a theorist. These are really significant words for someone who thought and wrote as much as he did about abstract ideas. But I mention this story again to underscore how important the world of practical affairs was for Plato. To make a long story short, this venture in Sicily did not turn out so well. Plato was imprisoned. At one point, he feared for the loss of his life. It turned out that Dionysius II, a young and impressionable and apparently inclined to philosophy as he was not really interested in learning. And so Plato concludes a couple of things from this that are worth mentioning. First of all, he concludes that managing the affairs of the city is very difficult. And secondly, that not everybody really wants to learn the most important things. And that becomes important because in a little bit we'll talk about the question, why dialogue? That the mode of instruction has a lot to do with the capacity, the willingness of young leaders or potential young leaders to learn. Plato goes on to say At last I came to the conclusion that all existing states are badly governed and the condition of their laws practically incurable without some miraculous remedy and the assistance of fortune. And I was forced to say, in praise of true philosophy, or of the true love of wisdom, that from her height alone it was possible to discern what was the nature of justice, either in the state or in the individual, and that the ills of the human race would never end until either those who are sincerely and truly lovers of wisdom come into political power, or the rulers of our city, by the grace of God, learn true philosophy. And now we finally get to the philosopher kings. So Plato recognized that there was this intersection between my life as an individual and the circumstances in which I find myself. And we'll come back to that theme in a second. But let me put this up. What is honored in a country is cultivated there. What is honored in a country is cultivated there. Plato's engagement with the world of practical affairs led him to conclude that the most important things, the things that really ought to be honored, require a soil. That if we're going to train young leaders, it actually requires a setting for the virtues, for the wisdom that leadership requires to take root and to be nourished. And here we have the famous quotation which I just read about philosopher kings. And Plato gives us a stark choice. Either those who have taken the time to be wisdom, those, if you've read the allegory of the cave, who are not concerned about power and ambition, unless those people end up in positions of authority, we're not going to have justice, we're not going to have the best laws. Or, unless those who are in power decide to take time out and reflect on justice, on wisdom, on their passions, then we're not going to have justice or the best laws. And so as we think about this injunction of the philosopher king, we have to ask ourselves, how realistic is either possibility? I apologize, this is a very bleak point in the talk on what's otherwise a beautiful Tuesday evening by the fire. Here we have Socrates on doing right and wrong. Socrates, of course, was Plato's teacher. And Socrates figures in two parts in the first story that I told you. When the initial coup took place in Athens, those friends and relatives of Plato approached Socrates and said, "Socrates, we need your help to do in a just man who's getting in the way of what we want to accomplish." And Socrates says, "No, I will not associate myself with that injustice." And then, when that group is overthrown, the democracy is reinstated, it's the democracy that puts Socrates on trial and says, "Oh, Socrates, you ask too many questions. That soil that we want to cultivate, what we honor in our country, is being disrupted by what you're saying, by what you're doing." And they put him to death. So you thought Plato's experience of practical affairs was bleak before. Now the full bleakness comes home. What do you do when a friend, a teacher especially, someone you love, is put to death unjustly? What is your relationship to that country? Socrates, for his part, on doing right or wrong, says this, and it's hard to read up here, but you'll have to trust me. "A man who is good for anything ought not to calculate the chance of living or dying. He ought only to consider whether in doing anything he is doing right or wrong. For neither in war, nor yet at law, ought I or any man to use every means of escaping death. The difficulty, my friends, is not to avoid death, but to avoid unrighteousness." The difficulty, my friends, is not to avoid death, but to avoid unrighteousness. Wherefore, O judges, be of good cheer about death, and know of a certainty that no evil can happen to a good man in life or after death. That's part of the apology, Socrates' speech before the accusing tribunal. How then do we link this concern for right and wrong with the concern for practical affairs, which is primarily concerned with expediency? And I'd like to give you a kind of anchor for thinking about this. And it doesn't cover all of Plato's thought, but it helps orient our thinking of a lot of Plato's thought in a short and I hope understandable diagram. So we have here a couple of axes. Bill's right, that doesn't work. Horizontally, we have the ethical. Vertically, we have what Plato calls the erotic. Let me say a little bit about what this means for Plato. The erotic, the vertical axis, what do we desire? What do we desire? The horizontal, the ethical, what do we do? And the Greek word ethos is important here because we think about ethics as a kind of professional code. The word ethos really is a way of being in the world. And ancient Greek is wonderfully complex in having a number of words that capture this sense. One is a sense of ethos, right? We still use that in English. The word for law is either nomos, right? It refers to either the written law or to custom. So these are the habits of life horizontally and the desires vertically. What are the parameters of the desires? We have the true, the beautiful, and the good at the top. And by the way, eros here doesn't just mean sex. That's a very powerful desire. But erotic here really means that profound desire for anything. So the true, the beautiful, and the good at the top, the correspondingly false, ugly, and bad, and enter Clint Eastwood now. The ethical axis. We've got the worst laws and the best laws. And these two axes really define the field of human action. So you have reflection, you have action in an endless circle. So Plato withdraws from the world of practical affairs so that he can reflect. He's intentional about choosing the moments of his action, but he's always thinking of this field of action defined by our desires on the one hand and what we do on the other. And we could do a quick plot here, right? What if, and by the way, this works both for individuals and for cultures. So what happens when we have an individual who desires the true, the beautiful, and the good, but finds himself or herself in a culture that attends to the worst laws, right? So you're in the bottom left-hand, you're in the top left-hand. Or what happens when you have the best laws, but the regime that has the best laws is occupied by people who desire the false, the ugly, and the bad? So what's optimal? Obviously, it's the upper right, where the individuals and the culture desire what's true, beautiful, and good, and we have a regime of laws that we could characterize as the best or just. That's Plato's field of action. And while it may cover a lot of his great dialogue, The Republic, it's no excuse not to read The Republic, which you all will go home and do, I have no doubt. So where does this leave us exactly? That's Plato's predicament. How do we get both the best human beings and the best laws? How do we do that? He goes to Sicily and he says, No city could enjoy tranquility, no matter how good its laws, when its men think they must spend their all on excesses and be easygoing about everything except the feasts and drinking bouts and the pleasures of love that they pursue with professional zeal. How do you cultivate virtue and leadership in a corrupt society? How do you arouse in others a desire for the life of nobility and virtue? Plato goes so far as to say if we could have 50 men in 10,000, we'd have a critical mass. If you do the math real quickly, that's 1 in 200. That's actually not that bad a ratio, except when you consider the difficulty of getting plotted in the upper right-hand corner. So why do I say all of this? I say all of this in part because, why Plato? Because Plato was a philosopher, clearly, of the highest order. But Plato was passionately concerned about what today we would call leadership development. And so in the Aspen Institute, in the Aspen Seminar on Leadership Values in a Good Society, we afford an opportunity for leaders from all sectors, from all over the world, to take several steps back from the world of practical affairs, to examine their desires, to think about the culture in which we live, and to recalibrate how they're going to bring their particular authority, their particular talents, their particular loves to bear. And so now we have come from Athens to Aspen. Fast forward to 1950. Ortega y Gasset says, "I am myself and my circumstances. I cannot save myself unless I save my circumstances. I am myself and my circumstances. I cannot save myself unless I save my circumstances. I cannot be merely a lover of wisdom unless I care about the environment in which I live." Ortega is re-articulating at the founding of the Aspen Institute for Humanistic Studies in 1950, in his own way, this Platonic field. And Walter Pepke, for his part, says this: "It worried us," again in 1950, "that the politicians' appeals for votes seldom held more than cynical promise of higher living standards, as if man were a creature who lives by bread alone. And it struck us as the saddest kind of irony that for all the time and energy and money that have been spent to achieve unprecedented physical security, we have reaped the greatest harvest of ulcers, alcoholism, and neuroses in the nation's history." That's 1950. Right? That could have been Plato in 387. So Plato, Pepke, Adler are articulating fundamental, perennial human predicaments. And of course, they were looking at 2 world wars and a Great Depression and saw a different complementary set of competing axes. On the one hand, there was the voice of science. We'd just dropped the atomic bomb. We had unprecedented technological capability. And in those lectures in 1950, there was an intense interest to have the humanist voice expressed, not to the denigration of the scientific voice, but as a significant complement to the scientific voice. We needed a humanistic voice. And so what in the fall and winter of 1949 was originally talked about as the Aspen University became, in part because of Ortega y Gasset's ruminations, the Aspen Institute for Humanistic Studies. So that's the arc of some of what happens in 1950. At the same time, in 1950, that the new summer was launching after the great Goethe bicentennial of 1949, Walter Paepcke's company, the Container Corporation of America, was embarking on a revolutionary new advertising campaign. And these slides that I've shown you are actually magazine advertisements for the Container Corporation of America. These are designed to sell cardboard boxes. Not entirely, we'll come back to that story. But it does reflect that intense interest on the part of Paepcke and others to unite body, mind, and spirit, but also to unify the world of ideas, the world of art, and of course, the world of music. What is honored in a country is cultivated there. You can reverse that statement and say, we can tell what's honored by what's cultivated. Take a moment, wherever you stand on any of these cultural political matters, and ask, what is it that we honor today? What is it that we cultivate? Plato on wisdom in government. Socrates on right and wrong. My graph. This is another one of the advertisements. This is Socrates again. And then this is Socrates on the good of man. I do nothing but go about persuading you all, old and young alike, not to take thought for your persons or your properties, but first and chiefly to care about the greatest improvement of the soul. I tell you that virtue does not come from money, but that from virtue comes money, and every good of man, public as well as private. The world of philosophy, the world of ideas, is not, for Socrates or for Plato, divorced from the world of practical affairs. And so we get actually to the first advertisement that the Container Corporation of America put out about 10 days before the beginning of the lectures in Aspen in 1950. It runs under the heading, The Great Ideas of Western Man. Walter and Elizabeth Paepcke were instrumental in thinking about the design. And the arrangement went something like this. Adler and Hutchins would produce a series of quotations. The design and advertising department at the Container Corporation in Chicago would select some notable ones. They'd outsource to leading artists, including Herbert Bayer and Henri Matisse, many others, and leave them totally free on the design. They weren't in keeping with a kind of a Bayer-esque Bauhaus sensibility to be necessarily illustrative of the text, but they were supposed to be inspired by the text. And what's the first one? It's Alexander Hamilton on human nature and government. If men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. In framing a government which is to be administered by men over men, the greatest difficulty lies in this. You must first enable the government to control the governed, and in the next place, oblige it to control itself. That's the founder's riff on Socrates and Plato's original problematic. And it's fascinating to me that in 1950, as the Aspen Institute for Humanistic Studies is being launched, so too this tremendous advertising campaign, which goes on for almost 20 years afterwards, and is a landmark in modern art and advertising, Paepcke is doing the same thing. And this is what Herbert Bayer says about this effort. And by the way, I strongly commend to you the Bayer exhibition that is downstairs if you haven't had a chance to see it. Bayer writes this: in 1950, the Container Corporation of America embarked on a unique campaign which had no sales message and was of a purely institutional character. The idea for great ideas of Western man is in part an outgrowth of the philosophical roundtable discussions at the Aspen Institute for Humanistic Studies. One of the Institute's objectives is to develop man's understanding of his role in our society and the goals toward which he can direct his life. In days of social and moral uncertainty, it is good to recall and contemplate some of the ideas which great men have given us. It is timely to reread and think about the fundamental rights and aspirations of man, about liberty, justice, and government. from Athens to Aspen once again. And Pepke, reflecting later on this advertising campaign, says this: "And now you may ask, what are the results? Does it sell boxes?" The answer to that is, the direct sale of boxes is not and never has been the purpose of our institutional advertising. How astonishing. But insofar as it creates an acute awareness of our company, giving it a distinctive personality and identifying it with the best in graphic art, it succeeds extremely well. It succeeds extremely well. And he goes on to say that we can document many instances where people didn't know about the boxes but did know about the advertising. And finally, he says, Pepke that is, "It is difficult, almost impossible, to check the amount of discussion actually stimulated by the great ideas, advertisements. It must suffice to say that public response is continuous and indicative, that the statements do stimulate much thinking. Furthermore, when people say that we are helping to promote good citizenship, we know the campaign is good advertising." This is not just the unity of thought and action. It's the articulation that business and the world of business has something to contribute to citizenship. And that original Platonic problematic, who is going to govern? And are those who are governing going to be governed by noble or base desires? That problematic hasn't gone away. So why Plato? Because Plato's concerns are our concerns, and we've now come to 1950. But why dialogue? Briefly, let me say this before wrapping up. Plato recognized that this engagement of the axis, what are our passions, what do we desire, with the axis of what is it that we do, takes time to explore, and that it has to be the give and take in word, in speech, in face-to-face communication, that virtue is explored, that virtue might take root. And so when you hear the Aspen Institute talking about its convening power, that's very much what we have in mind, that in a world that's fast-paced, in a world that's digitally mediated, nothing can replace what we're doing tonight, sitting together face-to-face as human beings, thinking about the big ideas, but then also thinking about how the big ideas affect how we're actually going to live. Plato's insight is rather troubling, particularly if you're an educator like me. Plato learns from Socrates that the most important things cannot be taught, they can only be learned. Think about what that means for a second, and it is one of the derivations of the allegory of the cave. What if the most important things cannot be taught but only learned? What does that mean for leadership development? And so if we fast forward today, we ask the question, why dialogue? Because it's only through dialogue that we can explore this relationship between reflection or thought on the one hand and action on the other. And so we talk about high-minded ideals, but that's always a preparation for stepping back into the fray of practical affairs. We go up out of the cave and we come back into the cave endlessly, because we can't live in either place all the time if we're to be thoughtful, virtuous people. So that's why dialogue. And when we bring people together for the Aspen Executive Seminar, when we bring people together for Society of Fellows Symposia, for the Ideas Festival, for the community programs, for the myriad of things that we do, we're trying to create that space for the relationship between thought and action, without necessarily a particular agenda other than we think that conversation, that dialogue, that mode of engagement is important and happens relatively rarely. Which leads to the third and final question, why us? We have to do that. I can't do it. No one of us can do it. We're all cultivating that original garden that either honors or doesn't honor what is noble and best about what it means to be human. And we do it each in our own way. Aristotle, Plato's great student, someone once observed that it's amazing to think that you can have a teacher as smart as Plato and to have a student as smart as Aristotle who disagrees with his teacher about so many things. But that's exactly what one would want, not a slavish imbiber of what one taught, but the real give and take of dialogue. But Aristotle, Plato's great student, defines the problem this way. He says virtue is to do the right thing in the right way, for the right reason, to the right person, at the right time. That's really simple. I won't get the order in the same. To do the right thing in the right way, to the right person, at the right time, for the right reason. That's virtue or excellence for Aristotle. But if we think about each of our actions and ask whether they pass that test, then all of a sudden, at least for me, the dynamic becomes a little more troubling. How do we think about how to do the right thing in the right way to the right person for the right reason at the right time? We do it by reflecting. We do it by acting. And in that sense, the question why Plato pushes us into the question why Aristotle, because of course Mortimer Adler was not a great Plato man, he was a great Aristotle man. And whether that becomes the talk for next year remains to be seen. But why Plato? Because Plato's concerns are our concerns, they're perennial concerns. Why dialogue? Because those concerns, those predicaments, can't be handled by one-page memoranda and bullet points or tweets. And why us? Because if we don't do it, if we collectively don't provide a space and then occupy the space for that kind of engagement of what it means to be just, what it means to be virtuous, then our circumstances will deteriorate. And if our circumstances deteriorate, our capacity for living true, beautiful, and good lives is evermore at risk. We need both the high-minded ideals of the philosophers. We need the thoughtful, pragmatic, principled action of people in practical affairs. And that is what we collectively do today in Aspen and around the world. Thank you for your attention. Thank you for all that you bring to the great conversation. And now we can have question and answer. Yes, please.
Very well put together. Is this working?
Yes.
My name is John McCormick, and I think something that we need to remember here is that Plato heralded the transition from the poets being the leaders in society to the philosophers, and the Republic was in fact written as an argument for why the philosophers should be the leaders in society. And Plato also referred to his forms, which were a set of beliefs. I happen to feel that this transition from right brain thinking of the poets to left brain thinking of the philosophers has caused a great injustice in our environment. And though Mortimer Adler is revered, and I've studied under him, he had a set of values which he held were to be adhered to by all of us, I think that this set of thinking is what's caused wars, religious wars, societies wars, etc. And so when we ask the question, why Plato, I think it's more important to ask the question, why us? And when you ask the question, why us, it's because we're in a point where we'll either have an evolution of consciousness or we're going to be a short-lived species, which means every single person in this room has an opportunity to contribute to the dialogue, to contribute to who we are, to possibly pass beyond this environment that creates wars, which is a set of beliefs, and to take a look at why us. And why us? Because it is time for us to go back to the original premise of why the Pepkes founded the institution, which is to look at ideas, to be open to ideas, to not be stuck in a set of beliefs, whether it be, by the way, Plato and Socrates didn't get along very well. And Plato and Aristotle didn't get along very well because I think they had problems with his set of beliefs. So back to the dialogue, I hope I'm contributing to the dialogue, to why us is because we are at a turning point in civilization whether we will either contribute to the evolution of consciousness or we won't. Thank you.
Thank you. And so there are a couple of things there, and I'll come back to the issue of poetry and philosophy. But the short answer to the implicit question, which in fact I think you answered, is it's not why just Plato, but why Plato and everyone else. And I think it's important that it's not the Plato Institute. We'll come back to the question of poetry, but I'd like to get a number of questions on the table and then see if I can, through some magical talent, synthesize them all. Yes?
Hello, very simple question. It's been said when somebody asked a politician as to what is happening to us and what controls our being, and the answer was, events, my dear, events. In other words, stuff happens. What does Plato have to say about that?
That's a great question. What does Plato have to say about the dominance of events? We'll come back to that and talk about poetry as well. Next question. There was here.
When you introduce religion into this mix, which we seem to have done in contemporary society, where the good to one person is the ugly to another, and the good law is the bad law, how does Plato address that issue as opposed to just virtuous?
That's a great question. So we'll talk about religion and our higher longings. How's that? A couple more, please. Don't worry, they won't get lost. Yes.
The question is, why not us?
Why not us? All right, yes.
My question is, Plato is very wonderful, Socrates, Aristotle, all of them. Why not some more contemporary philosophers, such as Ken Wilber, Raymond Panikkar, who have some wonderful things to say about that, seem to be more evolved in the human way of thinking, and provide some wonderful answers to all the questions we're asking here tonight.
Great, thank you. And it's actually not unrelated to the question of religion that was raised earlier. A couple more, and then I'll do my best.
There are two quotes from Plato that particularly struck me. The first one, wise men speak because they have something to say, fools because they have to say something. So at the risk of being a fool, I'll put another quotation forward as a question. Democracy, ... is a charming form of government. full of variety and disorder, and dispensing a sort of equality to equals and unequals alike. Do we agree with that?
Great question. Although given the first quotation, whatever I say, I'm going to get into trouble for. So let's see if we can pull these things together a little bit. Poetry. Plato famously writes against the poets in the Republic, in part because of his relationship with religion. Greek religion was anchored in the work of the poets, right? The playwrights disclosed some gods that weren't particularly, in Socrates or Plato's mind, worthy of being worshipped. So think about all the mischief that the gods get up to in Greek tragedy or in Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. That's a problem. But Plato ends the Republic with a myth, with a story. And we could argue, I'm inclined to say, that Plato is perhaps one of the greatest dramatists of the human condition of all time. He writes dialogues, which are, if you read them out loud, in especially a common communal context, they work like plays. You laugh at them. They embody personalities. Plato's always trying to engage his interlocutors in 3 dimensions. So this argument about Plato and philosophy is a complicated one. And I say that because even though professionally I'm a philosopher, I often think of myself as a poet masquerading as a philosopher. That great 20th century philosopher A.A. Milne has Winnie the Pooh say, "Poetry isn't something you go out and get. It's something that happens to you." Poetry isn't something you go out and get, it's something that happens to you, which brings us back to this question of religion. What happens when our engagement with our highest longings, our highest desires, bump up against each other, right? That's one of the contemporary questions of the relationship between religion and secularism, particularly in the public sphere. Plato was on one side of that argument in ancient Athens. It's a problem that hasn't gone away. And it's related to the question of democracy, because if we say in democracy that democracy distributes things equally, and we have to treat all desires equally, how are we going to navigate this axis? And there's no easy answer to that except to say that we're better when we do it in dialogue instead of in war or by violence. But we're always, I think for Plato, and I think we're always for the founders of the Institute who had lived through this, on the precipice of descending into violence. And I have to say, I have the privilege of moderating these seminars, these kinds of seminars, in Romania, in Spain, in Italy. And when you talk about how to navigate that terrain in a country that had 60 years of totalitarian government in the case of a brutal government in the case of Romania, or a fascist dictatorship in the case of Spain, right? That's a real question. How do we talk about the true, the beautiful, and the good, what's most noble about what it means to be human, in a way that's productive and humanizing rather than something that leads us into violence and chaos? So why not us? If not us, who? I will say that my travels around the world talking about values, talking about these things, produce a common response. 1, these ideas matter. 2, we don't have them in our country. 3, we don't trust the institutions to be able to deliver us for them. But we do, whatever else we might think about the United States, we do look to the United States as that culture, that country that has evolved more than any other to the ability to wrestle with these questions in a humane and humanizing, nonviolent way. We're not perfect, but what they say is that if you guys can't do it, what hope do we have? And in that sense, this has nothing to do with military power. This has to do with what is honored in our country is cultivated here. And if we're not cultivating that, the light gets a little dimmer for a lot of other people who have lived under really, really awful regimes. Why not Ken Wilber and other contemporary authors? We do read them. I'm still trying to figure out which Ken Wilber piece to put into various syllabi. But when I say why Plato, and it comes back, I think, even to the first question, it's not just Plato. It's the great conversation. And if the great conversation were simply this historical navel-gazing, then we would not be fulfilling the promise and the purpose that Plato, who disagreed with his teacher, that Aristotle, who disagreed with his teacher, that Adler, who disagreed with all his teachers and everybody else, as far as I can tell, we would not be fulfilling their promise or purpose. And that's not a way of ending the conversation. It's a way of saying, this is exactly the dialogue that we should be having. I realize I've kept you 3 minutes past 7, and so I look to my keepers to see whether we want to keep going or whether we bring things to a formal conclusion. What do my keepers say? I'll take 1 or 2 more questions, sure. Okay. Are there any other questions?
If the most important things are not taught, they are to be learned, how do we then, as philosopher kings or anyone else who wish to contribute, create environments in which we learn the most important things?
How do we create environments in which we can learn the most important things? Any other questions? I will comment on that. I'm not sure how exactly, because I think that is the question.
You haven't checked out destiny.
Destiny?
Events.
Oh, events. I left out events. I apologize. So we'll take that as a reminder of thank you. I apologize. We'll link it to creating the space. So my boss, Walter Isaacson, was on the radio a couple of weeks ago commenting on the great man theory of history from Carlyle in reference to Nelson Mandela's death. And this is a perennial question, right? Isn't it events that drive history? Or is it human beings and human action that drive history? Right? Surely it's both. If we go back to Ortega y Gasset's insight, I am both I and my circumstances. Right? Mandela didn't have to emerge the way he did. Right? Václav Havel didn't have to emerge the way he did. Gandhi, Martin Luther King, these astonishingly great human beings who defined themselves and their age by rising above events, not by dismissing them, but by refusing to be determined by them. And that's actually linked to the question of how do we create environments where the most important things can be learned. God forbid that we spend time in solitary confinement like Nelson Mandela. But one of the things that Nelson Mandela learns on Robben Island is forgiveness. So we have 3 choices. Either we don't learn anything at all. We learn by some of the worst circumstances imaginable. Or we learn because we have created spaces in which we can become wiser. So let me conclude with this thought. And I'm getting out my broad paintbrush now, so bear with me. I think it's really instructive that the founders of the Aspen Institute did not create the Aspen University. The university, along with the Catholic Church, is an institution longer than any other in continuous existence, I think, and as a formal institution. The university is about 1,000 years old. I left the university to come to the Aspen Institute in part because I was increasingly convinced that that institution that we have evolved as a Western culture over a millennium was no longer adequate in its current construction to address the question of how are we going to learn the most important thing for our age. I'm not denigrating universities. I'm about to become a tuition payer for my daughter at a very good college, Colorado College, my alma mater. And there are important things that happen there. But the question remains whether that institution, and we could talk about religious institutions as well, whether those institutions as they're currently constructed are adequate to the challenges that we face, that's an open question. And so to your question, how do we create spaces where we, as ordinary human beings, can rise above events rather than being determined by them as though we were simply billiard balls in a Newtonian mechanistic system? We have intellect, we have will, we are emerging out of events and circumstances, but unlike the other species, more or less, we have the capacity to reshape, to redesign, to reimagine the circumstances in which we and our children will live, which again is why us is so important. And if we go back to the portraits that I mentioned at the very beginning, looking into Albert Schweitzer's eyes in that great Berko black and white photograph, and thinking about the astonishing convergence of this astonishing man who spent so much of his time in Africa, who was noted really as being a Bach scholar before he won the Nobel Prize, coming to Aspen, of all places, and talking about what he thought was the challenge of our age. He said that we measure progress by an increased standard of living, and arguably few people have done more than Albert Schweitzer to help other people's standards of living. He said, we can't measure our progress as a civilization, as a species, by our standard of living. We have to measure our progress against the scale of what it means to be an ethical personality, to be someone who has inhabited and helped others inhabit spaces where we can learn the most important things and so transcend the circumstances of our age. And that's us. Thank you all. P.S. This is another one of the Container Corporation advertisements, and in deference to Stephen's talk last year, it's Wolfgang von Goethe on man's happiness. The highest happiness of man as a thinking being is to have probed what is knowable and quietly to revere what is unknowable. We exist in that tension between what's knowable and unknowable, and our hope is that the Aspen Institute and your contributions, the contributions that you make in dialogue and in your presence, help us navigate that terrain between what we know and what we don't know. Thanks again.